What's up, guys? Welcome back to another personality video. Today, what is extroversion? No frills, no bullshit. What is it? I'm going to try to flesh it out and conceptualize it in a few different ways. Because usually when someone explains what extroversion is, they're only giving a description of what the effect is of being extroverted, like how it's the behavior that it produces, So people often use the explanation, you start out with 5 tokens at the beginning of the day if you're introverted, and every time you interact with someone, you give a token away. And if you're extroverted, the opposite happens. You start out with no tokens. You start out feeling kind of depleted, and you're energized by being around people. This brings us to the first error in traditional surface level explanations of what extroversion is, and that is that it has nothing to do with other people at all. People are simply an outlet for extroverted people to feed off of, but other people doesn't give you any depth of description as to what extroversion is. The first thing is that extroversion is, roughly speaking, dopamine orientation. So it's the positive emotion dimension. If you are extroverted, you are likely to be seeking a dopamine fix. And the effect of that can be that you get that from other people, but you can also get that from drugs. You can also get that from adrenaline, rock climbing, cliff hanging, stuff like that. So there are many ways that you can feed your extroversion. That is your need for a dopamine fix, your need for expression of positive emotion, reactiveness to things that you perceive as positive. So it goes even deeper. It's a matter of perception, being sort of dopamine oriented, and that doesn't tell the whole story, by the way, but it affects the way that you see things. Someone who's highly neurotic and therefore high in either withdrawal or reactivity, volatility, can look at a cliff as a falling off place, a dangerous place. Whereas someone who's, say, low in neuroticism and high in extroversion, so they're sort of seeking a fix, can see it as a means of producing excitement within them. So another thing I want to touch on is shyness. There's really no correlation between being introverted and being shy. And that is because introversion is simply the lack of extroversion. Introversion doesn't mean that you're depressed or shy or anything like that. It just means that you're not very excitable, If we take a Petersonian approach, extroversion breaks down into 2 aspect traits. Those are enthusiasm, that's really where the dopamine part of it is, and assertiveness. That's the other thing, which we don't really know what the foundation for that is biologically. There may not be one, but anyway, it's another thing. And assertiveness and enthusiasm can vary independently. So you can be, 60% in one, 10% in the other. That's going to come out to being 50%. You're an ambivert. Let's say you're 70% one, 10% the other, 60th percentile. You're going to be more extroverted and considered an extrovert, right? But, if you look at Myers-Briggs, Myers-Briggs isn't about, figuring out which letter for each dimension you are. Am I an extrovert or am I an introvert? No, you have to look at the cognitive functions. So Myers-Briggs is a totally different thing. You have to look at, what is found grounding your behavior. What functions of perception and judgment are forcing you one way or the other. So anyway, introversion is simply the lack of extroversion, the lack of being dopamine oriented, roughly speaking, and seeking excitement, something to be enthusiastic about. Yeah, shyness though, it might be a little bit correlated with introversion. That is the lack of extroversion, because from an extroverted standpoint, it's simply the lack of assertiveness. But you can still be high in reactivity to things you perceive as positive. That is to be enthusiastic and still be considered an extrovert. But no, I think shyness is more rooted in neuroticism. Again, neuroticism breaks down into withdrawal and volatility, and that is the negative emotion dimension. And so if you're high, I think in the withdrawal aspect of neuroticism, it follows that you're shy. But again, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily like very, internally, chemically reactive to things you perceive as negative. That would be volatility aspect of neuroticism. So again, those things vary independently, and so do the cardinal traits, neuroticism and extroversion. Also, an interesting thing about extroversion is, and this is my theory, but it fits. It's very coherent and congruent with what is the case in academic psychology when they talk about Big Five traits. That Big Five is really the model that they use for personality in academic research. But then apart from that, you also have Myers-Briggs, you have Enneagram, you have certain aspects of astrology that kind of talk about extroversion and introversion. For example, I would say that Sagittarius energy is very extroverted. Sagittarius people really value fun in their life and excitement. So they do things that produce excitement. They tend to be pretty extroverted, but they don't necessarily tend to be neurotic. So they're not really so shy, although they can be. But they don't tend to be depressed necessarily. Although I do know some depressed Sagittarians. It's just that whether or not you're depressed has no bearing or root in the fact that you're extroverted. The proneness to depression is more about being high in neuroticism, regardless of how extroverted you are. So I would say that, say, Scorpio energy is more depressive. It's more neurotic. And then it varies in terms of, they vary in terms of, extroversion, how willing they are to go out and find the thing that, produces positive emotion. And then I would look at Aries energy. Aries energy, it's interesting. They just tend to be reactive, for better and for worse. So Aries, I think, tend to be, because they're sort of young souls, they're kind of prone to reacting to the environment around them in a big way. So they have lots of highs and lots of lows. So they have lots of positive energy and lots of negative energy. So I would say that Aries energy tends to be high in extroversion and high in neuroticism as well. I don't know, like Aries suns, But anyway, that's just to draw a little astrological connection. But the other thing I wanted to say about extroversion, which is interesting, this is my theory, is that ADD and ADHD don't really exist. That's just the behavioral effect from being highly extroverted. So if you're highly dopamine oriented, and perhaps very assertive too, but highly dopamine oriented, especially the enthusiasm level, always chasing enthusiasm, and then the result of that is that you tend to lack focus for things because it's almost like you're chasing an addiction. People who are high in extroversion tend to have more addictive personalities, especially if they're also neurotic, because that means that they're compensating for negative emotion. But I think ADD and ADHD are not real categories. That's simply very high extroversion. So let's say ADD is like between 90th and 95th percentile in extroversion. You're kind of ADD. You're very excitement seeking. You tend to lack focus as the result of chasing enthusiasm all the time. And then ADHD is just the more extreme version of that. So it might be like 95th percentile to 100th percentile. Does that make sense? That's what ADHD and ADD are, I think. It's just hyper extroversion, too much of any trait can be a bad thing. Therefore, we want to slap a label onto it and diagnose people with it so we can fucking prescribe them drugs and take their money. So anyway, that's what I think that's what those categories actually are. So anyway, yeah, this is my video on extroversion. To recap, extroversion in a Petersonian framework and Big Five framework breaks down into enthusiasm, which is the dopamine-oriented and excitement-seeking and reactiveness to things you perceive as positive, part of your personality, and also assertiveness, the drive that you have from within to go out and get what you want, to attack it head on. And then shyness is another thing that's more rooted in the withdrawal aspect of neuroticism, I would say. But you're not introverted because you're shy. That's a separate thing. You're introverted because you're simply lacking in that dopamine orientation. You're lacking in extroversion. Again, it has nothing to do with people. You can be very people-oriented and be very introverted. Being people-oriented is more just like, it's a maternal instinct that we all have in varying degrees, women more than men, But being people-oriented is a separate thing. There's maybe only a mild correlation between being extroverted and being people-oriented. People are simply a tool that highly extroverted people use to gain excitement. So anyway, I hope that's clear. I may do more videos on this if there's anything left undone, but that's in a nutshell my understanding of really what extroversion is. Hope I've dispelled of some of the shallow descriptions of that personality trait. But anyway, I like being able to draw connections, between what I know in, say, Big Five, and especially dispelling of some of the myths about extroversion and introversion in Myers-Briggs, because that can get really shallow really quickly. And also drawing some connections between this trait and astrology, which I think is important to bring in. And if you get a description from, a clinical psychologist about extroversion, he's not going to be allowed to go there and talk about astrology because he's part of the machine, and he's not really allowed to talk about certain things because he'd lose his fucking job. Astrology really being one of them. So anyway, but I have a lot of experience and a lot of years and a lot of books under my belt with personality, and I'm not part of a machine, so you can more or less trust my word, but of course question it, and we'll figure out the truth along the way, the deeper truths about a lot of these personality dimensions, which is a really important area for the self-awareness process. And so anyway, that's my explanation of extroversion. Hope you liked it. Leave comments, let me know what you think. May do more videos on this trait later because it is one that carries a lot of baggage with it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.